You can't perform solo. Frank Sinatra said it slowly, deliberately, the way a man speaks when he wants every single syllable to land like a verdict. He wasn't whispering. He wasn't suggesting. He was declaring, on live television, in front of 40 million Americans, with the cameras rolling and nowhere in the world to hide. His finger was pointed directly at Bob Dylan, 6 inches from his face, and the studio had gone so completely quiet that the low hum of the overhead lights became, for just a moment, the loudest sound in the building. This was NBC Studio 6B, The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson. 200 people sat in those seats, and not one of them moved, not one of them whispered. The floor director, a man who had worked live television for 11 years and believed he had witnessed every possible thing a studio could produce, stood frozen at his station, with his cue card still raised. He forgot to bring it down. Johnny Carson sat behind his desk and did not reach for his pencil. He did not flash his famous smile. He simply watched, with the still and calculating quiet of a man who understood that what was unfolding in front of him had moved far beyond television. Bob Dylan did not flinch, did not look away. He reached slowly into the inside pocket of his jacket and withdrew a folded piece of paper, soft at the creases, the kind of paper that has been opened and refolded many times. He set it on his knee. He did not open it. In exactly 3 minutes and 40 seconds, Bob Dylan would do something that no producer, no executive, no audience member, and not Frank Sinatra himself had ever witnessed on live American television. And the most powerful entertainer on earth would never publicly challenge another artist again. If you have never heard what happened that night, stay right here, because nothing about it ended the way anyone in that room expected. Subscribe and hit the bell. Stories like this one every single week. But this moment, this finger, this silence, this folded piece of paper did not begin in Studio 6B. It began months earlier, in two completely different worlds that were never designed to occupy the same room. Frank Sinatra's world had a dress code. It had a conductor, an orchestra, and a lighting rig that cost more than most people earned in a year. By the late 1960s, Sinatra wasn't simply a singer. He was the architecture of American popular music made flesh. He had built something over 30 years that was precise and powerful and deeply personally his. Arrangements that took weeks to perfect, phrasing that other singers studied like scripture. He had performed for presidents, recorded with the greatest musicians alive, and turned the act of standing at a microphone into something that felt like controlled weather. To Sinatra, music was construction. Every note placed exactly where it belonged, every breath calculated, every silence earned. And then there was everything else. Rock and roll had arrived and eaten half his audience. The Beatles had come over from England and made his world look like a museum exhibit. Sinatra had watched all of it with a public smile and a private fury that his closest friends said never fully left his eyes after 1964. He didn't speak about it directly. Men like Sinatra didn't speak directly about the things that frightened them. Instead, he spoke about craft, about training, about the difference between a real performance and what he called, with a particular curl of his lip, noise. Bob Dylan's world had no dress code. Greenwich Village, 1961. Cigarette smoke and protest songs, and a 20-year-old kid from Hibbing, Minnesota, who had arrived in New York with a guitar case, a harmonica, and a set of songs that sounded like they'd been written by someone who had already lived a very long life. By the time the 1960s cracked open, Dylan had written words that a generation tattooed onto the inside of their chests. Blowin' in the wind, the times they are a-changin', a hard rain's a-gonna fall. The press called him the voice of a generation, a label he hated so completely that he spent the rest of the decade systematically destroying every expectation that came with it. In 1966, he nearly died A motorcycle accident on a back road in Woodstock, New York. He disappeared for 2 years. No tours, no interviews, no statements. He came back quieter, stranger, and completely unwilling to be anyone's symbol. He came back with a guitar, a handful of new songs, and that folded piece of paper he carried everywhere he went. 2 worlds, 2 men, 1 studio, and Johnny Carson sitting between them, watching the air in the room change the way air changes before a storm breaks. What nobody knew, not the audience, not the network, not the cameras, was that 45 minutes before airtime, Sinatra had already gone to find Dylan, backstage, alone. And what happened in that hallway was the real beginning of everything. There were 2 green rooms that night. That detail matters. Sinatra's green room had fresh flowers, a bottle of Jack Daniels, and 7 people in it. His manager, his vocal coach, 2 press handlers, and 3 others whose specific function nobody has ever been able to clearly explain. The room was warm and loud and smelled like expensive cologne. Sinatra sat at the center of it, the way he sat at the center of every room, not because he demanded it, but because rooms reorganized themselves around him without being asked. Dylan's green room had 2 people. His manager, Albert Grossman, who sat in the corner reading a newspaper without looking up, and a guitar tech named Eddie, who didn't speak unless spoken to. Dylan sat alone against the far wall, jacket on, guitar case flat on the floor beside his feet. He hadn't eaten. He wasn't pacing. He was doing the one thing that made everyone around him most uncomfortable. He was completely, unnervingly still. The folded piece of paper was in his hand. He was reading it, crossing something out, writing something new in the margin, folding it back, then opening it again 5 minutes later and starting the whole process over. Grossman watched this from behind his newspaper and said nothing. He had managed Dylan long enough to know that tonight was not a night for conversation. Then the door opened, without a knock. Frank Sinatra did not knock on doors. He walked through them, tuxedo pressed, fedora straight, the full weight of 30 years of American stardom coming through the frame ahead of him. He looked at the guitar tech, looked at Grossman, looked at Dylan. Then he looked at the guitar case on the floor and let the silence sit there for a moment before he spoke. "No band?" he said. Dylan didn't look up from the paper. "No band." Sinatra clasped his hands behind his back and walked slowly to the center of the room, the way a man walks through territory he is assessing. "I've done this show 14 times, he said. "You know what I bring every time? Arrangements, musicians, a sound that fills this building from the floor to the ceiling. You know why?" Dylan finally looked up. He didn't answer. He just looked. Sinatra held his gaze for a moment and then said the thing that was really bothering him. Not the guitars, not the folk songs, not the harmonica, the thing beneath all of it. "Because 40 million people are watching," Sinatra said, his voice dropping to something quieter and therefore more dangerous. "And 40 million people deserve more than one man sitting alone on a stage with a song nobody's heard." Dylan said nothing. He folded the paper, put it back in his pocket, picked up his guitar from the case, and began tuning it slowly, string by string, as if Sinatra had already left the room. Sinatra's jaw tightened. He started to say something else. And that was the moment the door opened for the second time, and Johnny Carson walked in. Carson had been doing this long enough to recognize a room that was 5 seconds from combustion. He looked at Sinatra, looked at Dylan, looked at the guitar in Dylan's hands. Then he pulled a chair from the corner, sat down without being invited, and said one thing, one sentence that nobody in that green room expected. It didn't cool the tension. It sharpened it into something precise and pointed and impossible to look away from. And the moment Carson said it, Sinatra turned and looked at Dylan with an expression that the guitar tech, who had been invisible in the corner this entire time, would describe to a journalist 20 years later as the look of a man who has just understood something he didn't want to understand. If you're watching this channel for the first time, subscribe right now. This story is just getting started. What the guitar tech heard in that green room in the final 4 minutes before airtime, and what he kept quiet about for 2 decades, was the real reason Dylan had agreed to come on this show at all. It had nothing to do with Sinatra. It had nothing to do with Johnny Carson. It had to do with what was written on that piece of paper. And once you know what it was, everything you are about to watch makes a completely different kind of sense. Johnny Carson's monologue that night lasted 8 minutes and 40 seconds. He would later tell his producer it was the worst monologue he had ever delivered. Not because the jokes weren't good. They were fine. They were exactly what they were supposed to be. But Carson was a man who read rooms the way other men read books, instinctively, completely, without effort. And the room that night was not reading back. 200 people sat in those seats, with their laughter half a second too late and their applause half a beat too short, because every single person in that studio could feel that something was wrong with the air. Something was coiled beneath the surface of the evening, and nobody could name it, and nobody could look away from it. Carson introduced both guests with the smooth, unhurried confidence that had made him the most trusted man on American television. The audience applauded. The cameras moved. And then Frank Sinatra walked out first. Tuxedo, fedora, that particular walk that belonged to no one else on earth, and settled into the guest chair with the ease of a man sitting down in his own living room. He crossed one leg over the other. He accepted the applause as his natural due. He was, in every visible way, completely at home. Then Bob Dylan walked out. The contrast was not subtle. Dylan in a rumpled brown corduroy jacket, dark shirt, sunglasses still on, guitar case in his left hand. He had refused to leave it backstage. He set it beside his chair before he sat down. He did not acknowledge the applause the way Sinatra had. He sat down the way a man sits down when he is thinking about something else entirely. His right hand went to his jacket pocket for just a moment, feeling for the paper, and then came back out empty. Carson opened with something neutral and professional, a question about the current state of American music. Safe ground, generous ground. Sinatra took it immediately, the way Sinatra took everything, with charm and precision, and a smile that had a very specific temperature. He talked about arrangement, about orchestration, about the craftsmanship that separated a performance from a moment. He was eloquent. He was compelling. He was also, in the specific and deliberate way that only Frank Sinatra could manage, building something, brick by brick, sentence by sentence, that was aimed directly at the man sitting beside him. Carson saw it happening. He tried once, carefully, to redirect. Sinatra didn't redirect. He smiled at Carson and continued building. Then he turned to the camera, not to Carson, not to Dylan, to the camera, to the 40 million people on the other side of it, and he said it. Bob's going to perform for us tonight. Just him and that guitar. No arrangement, no musicians, no support. You cannot hold 40 million people with one guitar and a song they have never heard. That is not a performance. That is a rehearsal. He said it warmly. He said it with a laugh in his voice. He said it the way men say devastating things when they want to make sure nobody can call it an attack. The studio audience laughed. That particular laugh that is half amusement and half the nervous release of people who don't know what they're witnessing. Carson's pencil tapped once on the desk, once, then stopped. 5 seconds of silence followed on live American television. The floor director was making frantic cutting gestures at Carson from behind the cameras. Carson did not look at him. He was watching Dylan. The entire studio was watching Dylan. 40 million people were watching Dylan. Dylan reached into his jacket, took out the folded piece of paper, opened it with both hands, read one line, just one, with his eyes moving slowly across the words as if he was reading them for the very first time, though the worn creases told a completely different story. Then he folded it carefully, returned it to his pocket, picked up his guitar. He did not respond to Sinatra. He did not look at Carson. He did not address the audience or the cameras or the 40 million people sitting in their living rooms across America. He simply placed his fingers on the strings and played the first chord. What came out of that guitar in the next 3 minutes was not what anyone in that room had prepared themselves to hear. It was not protest. It was not folk. It was not the voice of a generation or the sound of a movement or any of the other labels that had been pressed onto Bob Dylan like stamps on an envelope. It was something quieter and therefore more powerful than any of those things. A song that sounded as though it had been written in a single sitting, in a room with the curtains drawn, for an audience of exactly one person. His voice, raw, unpolished, cracked at the edges in the places where trained voices never crack, did the one thing that Frank Sinatra's 3 decades of perfected technique could not manufacture on demand. It told the truth without apology, and without arrangement, and without a single note of orchestration beneath it. Sinatra's arms, crossed when Dylan played the first chord, were no longer crossed by the second verse. The camera caught it only once, only briefly, a shot that lasted less than 2 seconds before the director cut away. But it was enough. His head had dropped slightly forward. His jaw was working slowly, the way a man's jaw works when he is trying to find something to say and the words keep dissolving before they reach his mouth. The song ended. The last note hung in the studio air for a long moment, and then Carson leaned forward, not as a host executing a professional transition, but as a human being whose body moved before his professional instincts could intervene, and asked Dylan one question. A question so specific, so unexpected, so completely unlike anything Carson had asked a guest in 11 years of hosting, that the studio audience heard it and went silent all over again. What Sinatra said in response to that question was recorded by every microphone in the room. The network cut it from broadcast within the hour. 3 people present that night have confirmed it existed. And what the great Frank Sinatra, the man who had spent 30 years telling the world exactly what music was supposed to sound like, said in that moment, were the last words anyone in that studio expected to come out of his mouth. The applause didn't build the way applause normally builds, starting thin at the edges and growing toward the center. It arrived all at once, like a single switch thrown in a dark room. 200 people on their feet simultaneously. The sound so sudden and so physical that the boom operator later said he felt it in his chest before he heard it with his ears. People were looking at each other the way people look at each other when they need to confirm that someone else witnessed what they just witnessed. A woman in the 3rd row was crying and appeared not to have noticed. The man beside her was gripping the armrest of his seat with both hands, as if the floor had moved. Carson let it run. He didn't signal the floor director. He didn't reach for his cards. He sat behind that desk and let 200 people stand in a television studio and feel whatever it was they were feeling, for as long as they needed to feel it. Then, during the commercial break, Carson did something he almost never did. He left his desk. He walked around to the guest chairs, sat on the edge of the coffee table between Sinatra and Dylan, leaned forward with his elbows on his knees, and asked Dylan about the paper. Dylan looked at him for a moment. Then he took it out, unfolded it one final time, and told Carson what was written on it. What Dylan said reframed everything the studio audience had just watched. The performance had not been about Sinatra. The challenge, the finger, the live television confrontation, none of it had touched the real reason Dylan had walked onto that stage with that guitar and that song. 7 months earlier, Dylan had lost someone, not to fame, not to distance, not to the ordinary erosions that pull people apart. He had lost someone the way you lose someone when there is no more time left and no more words, and the only language that remains is music. The song he had played, the one nobody in that studio had ever heard, the one that made his hands tremble slightly when he tuned the guitar backstage, had been written in a single night for that person and that person alone. He had carried it folded in his jacket pocket every day for 7 months because he could not bring himself to record it and could not bring himself to destroy it. Carson said nothing for a long moment after Dylan finished speaking. Then he nodded once, slowly, the way a man nods when words would only make things smaller. He stood up, walked back to his desk. The cameras came back on. Carson's face when the red light returned was the face of a man who had just been trusted with something irreplaceable and understood the full weight of that trust. Sinatra had not moved during any of this. He sat in his chair with his fedora in his hands. He had taken it off at some point during the break, though nobody remembered seeing him do it, and he was looking at the floor. Not with embarrassment, not with the deflated anger of a man who has lost an argument, with something quieter and more permanent than either of those things. With recognition. Subscribe right now and turn on notifications, because the part of this story that nobody ever talks about is coming in the next 60 seconds. What happened 40 minutes after the cameras stopped rolling in the parking structure beneath 30 Rockefeller Plaza, with no audience and no microphones and no entourage, is the moment that tells you everything about both of these men that the television cameras never could. Roy Tillman worked the overnight security desk at 30 Rockefeller Plaza for 22 years. He was not a man given to exaggeration. He had seen enough famous people come and go through that building to understand that fame was largely a costume, something people put on at the elevator and took off again by the time they reached their cars. He told his story exactly once to a journalist named Carol Mercer, who was writing a retrospective piece in 1989, and he told it the same way he told everything, plainly, without drama, because he genuinely did not understand why anyone would find it remarkable. Sinatra was standing beside his car in the lower level of the parking structure, alone for the first time all evening, his entourage having gone ahead to pull the other vehicles around. He had his fedora back on. He was lighting a cigarette. Dylan came through the stairwell door with his guitar case in his left hand, moving toward the exit, when Sinatra called out to him, not loudly, just enough to carry across the concrete. Dylan stopped, turned. The two men stood 10 feet apart under fluorescent lights, with no cameras and no audience and no live television, and no 40 million people between them. Just two men and a guitar case, and the particular silence of an underground parking structure at 11 o'clock at night. Sinatra spoke first. He told Dylan something specific about the song, not that it was good, not a compliment in the way compliments are usually constructed, but something that demonstrated with precise and uncomfortable clarity that Sinatra had understood exactly what the song was about, which meant Carson had told him about the paper during the break, which meant Frank Sinatra had sat in that guest chair through the second half of that broadcast, knowing the full truth of what he had just witnessed, and had said nothing. Dylan listened. Then he answered in 5 words. Roy Tillman remembered them because he didn't understand them. He repeated them to Carol Mercer exactly as he heard them. She published them. Within 48 hours, those 5 words were everywhere, and Bob Dylan never confirmed or denied them for the rest of his life. Carson never spoke about that night publicly, but his personal diary, portions of which were released by his estate after his death in 2005, contains one entry dated the evening of the taping. It is 3 sentences long. The 3rd sentence is underlined twice. 31 years after that broadcast, Bob Dylan accepted the Nobel Prize in Literature. He did not attend the ceremony in Stockholm. He sent a speech instead, written out by hand, read aloud by the American ambassador. It was careful and precise and deeply considered. But at one point, near the middle of it, Dylan paused the formal language and said something that had nothing to do with literature. He described a song he had written a long time ago for someone he had loved and lost. He did not name the song. He did not name the person. He said only that he had carried it folded in his jacket pocket for longer than he could remember, and that he had played it once in front of an audience, and that playing it had given him permission to let it go. Nobody in the Nobel Committee knew what he was referring to, But three people who had been inside NBC Studio 6B that night heard the speech and understood every word of it completely. In the last years of his life, a handwritten list was found in Frank Sinatra's dressing room after his final performance in 1995. Songs he returned to privately, songs that still meant something. Near the bottom of the list, in Sinatra's own handwriting, was a title nobody recognized, the song Dylan had played that night. Beneath it, Sinatra had written 4 words. Not a review, not a verdict, just 4 words that told you everything about what that 3-minute performance had done to the man who had said it couldn't be done. He wrote, "He was right, solo." If this story moved you, subscribe and share it with someone who still believes music is just sound.